about building real embedded IoT with C# using Meadow. Hey, Adrian, how's it going?
It's going well. Thank you so much for inviting us here.
I know. I think the last time I saw you was last year's .NET Conf, so that's cool.
Yeah, yes, great feedback. Yes,
Great.
heard
All
a
right,
whole
whenever
bunch
you're
from
ready,
you.
take it away.
Thank you very much. So yeah, my name's Adrian Stevens, and I am a program manager for Microsoft Learn. And so I'm always excited about that. I can tell you a tiny bit about that, and then we're gonna jump into my other favorite topics. Microsoft Learn, if you haven't been there, it is the place for free training on Microsoft. Head on over to docs.com/learn. There's 1,500 plus hours. There's probably more like 2,000 hours of content. Lots of stuff around .NET, of course. Azure, Power Ups, introduction to C#, machine learning, really cool stuff, localized, and there's a lot of free interactivity. Big fan of learning, and I get to work with these very talented people that build this content. Check it out. But today, I'm here to talk to you about IoT. And so when I am not a program manager for Microsoft Learn, I'm hacking hardware, and I'm an advisor for Wilderness Labs. And we're going to talk about .NET on IoT, on a real microcontroller IoT. So why do we care? Well, IoT really is, it's going to be the new game changer in our space. I like this. IoT is the new epoch. So if we think about the technology space we've been in, we really had mainframes that came on, and these monstrous computers, they were a major innovation. Think about NASA literally doing calculations for rocket launches by hands, and suddenly they could do things in an instant. And then we got to the place where we had desktops in every home, and then you had the power of those machines in your pockets with mobile. Well, now we're moving into the next phase, is really IoT, and this is going to be a game changer. And not only is it going to be a game changer, but it actually already is a game changer. This is a kind of a mind-blowing thought. IoT is already 3 times the size of mobile. The market share is bigger already, and by 2025, we're expecting 75 billion devices. 75 billion devices. And with that capability, that is compute and intelligence really everywhere. And our lives really are going to significantly change. So we think about this idea that, yeah, that desktop computer in every home, that was a major innovation. Well, now think about compute. Think about a microcontroller in just about everything. And this is really going to bring on a monstrous change in our culture. We're going to be collecting, processing, and sending data on almost every aspect of our life. And so what this really going to do is bring together a real change in the way we use physical things. And our physical world is going to become incredibly interconnected in very, very powerful and profound ways. And why am I telling you this? Well, because now is the time to upskill on hardware. I know I'm talking to a developer audience that knows the amazing power of .NET and C#. We build amazing applications. We heard about Blazor. We love Xamarin. We love desktop. .NET everywhere. Now imagine you can build your own things and leverage those software skills on the things that you build in the real world. And so with that, I'm going to talk to you about a product called Meadow by our friends over at Wilderness Labs. And there's a lot of really cool things I could tell you about the hardware, the infrastructure, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. But what I really want you to take away from this is full .NET applications on a microcontroller. This is a real microcontroller. This is not a microprocessor. This is not running Linux. This is running a simplified, abstract interface over the hardware, low power, super stable, and really economically cost effective. So your existing .NET skills deploying to actual hardware. So the best way to show this off to you is, well, to show it to you. So I'm going to jump over to a demo. So I'm going to apologize briefly. I'm going to move my camera. And hopefully that transition was relatively smooth and not too jarring. And we're going to build a climate monitor today. Let's get that camera centered. We can adjust the hardware there a little bit. And I'll just see, this is what we're going to build. I'm going to show you how to construct it, how to control it with C#.NET, and how you can find the parts to do this here. So the great thing about our .NET community and about Wilderness Labs is everything is open source. And so the project today we're going to use is called Klima. And this is mentioned, it's a climate station. You can go to github.com, Wilderness Labs, Klima. All the source code is here. I'm going to walk you through some of it. Of course, it has things like screenshots or actually images and wiring information such as well. So all the support you need is available. It's online. It's free right now. So the core Meadow product is this little guy here. And so this is, let me get that centered nicely so you can see it. Wonderful. So this is the Meadow board. And it has some really cool things on it. So it actually has not one, but two microcontrollers. One microcontroller is here to really control all of the input and outputs, all the data, all the things we're going to control. And then there's a second microcontroller used for network connectivity. And we'll look a little bit at both of those. And this is a really cool little board. And again, we can plug a lot of things into it. So we've got all kinds of stuff in our IoT world. So we've got piles of sensors, these little guys like this, and there's some fun ones on here. There's things like accelerometers and heart rate monitor and light sensors and color sensors, temperature sensors. And then, of course, we can add additional user interface pieces. So one of the things I am really passionate about are displays. It's a little bit hard to see. Let me do a little pan around here. And there's all kinds of fun hardware that we can use to build all our hardware solutions, which is pretty fantastic. But then, of course, the next question is, well, how do we get started? How do we go from those little bits and pieces to something more like this? Pardon me as I get the camera back up. We'll stop moving that around. Well, the great thing is we can head over to the Wilderness Labs website. And so developer.wildernesslabs.co. And there's a ton of great information. There's a lot of information on electronics and, of course, the Meadow platform itself. But there's something really powerful that this team has built, of course, with .NET, and that is Meadow Foundation. And Meadow Foundation is a layer, and for now, think of it as it's a big driver library. So when you're searching through all these parts, these electronics, there's software support for you to rapidly integrate and test and embed in your Meadow projects. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at our project here, you can see a couple of things. So I've got a display here. I'll just tilt that up and give you a slightly better view of it. And I also have on the side here, this here is an environmental sensor. And especially I'm using it for reading temperature data. So the one I have is called a BME 180. Now, historically, if you were building IoT projects, you would go and you might download, well, you might search to see if there's some code available, something to reference, or you might decide to hop in and read the actual data sheet. And those things can be 50 to 100 pages, and you can go through and understand the communication protocols and all the details about communicating that piece of hardware. Fortunately, with Meadow, we can give you a really big head start. So I'm going to jump into the Meadow guides here. And I'm going to scroll down to our Meadow Foundation section and click on Peripheral Drivers. And here, you can see a really big list of hardware drivers. So all those wonderful parts I showed you, well, there's a number of them here. Of course, you can see if they're working or not. Brief description. So let's scroll down. And well, first we'll get displays and graphics. So this display I'm going to be using is a TFT display. And specifically the ST7789. So again, okay, we've got a display. How do we use it? Lots of information here, some details. Fantastic. Right away, we have a code sample. Wonderful. And again, this now looks like C#, and we'll look at this a little more carefully in our example project. But right away, we've got a code sample, so we've got a starting point to use this controller, to use this piece of hardware. And then just as important, we've got the wiring information. And so with that, you can see, right away, I can see what pins, where to connect it on the device. So for those of us that haven't done a lot of hardware yet, we've got a really great head start. And the exact same thing we can do with our environmental sensor. I'll go back a page or two, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit further. And again, this gives you a nice sense of the scope of drivers available. And the team is doing a lot of fantastic work to extend this as well. And I'm looking for, there we go. So search for it, so I want you to fumble through it. There we go. My BMP 180 atmospheric sensor. In this case, I believe this one does both temperature and humidity. And again, same thing. Go in, get the information on the hardware, an example bit of code. In this case here, we're seeing a an observable pattern for subscriber model for consuming it, as well as the classic .NET event pattern, pretty fantastic. And again, our wiring example. All right, great. So let's take a look at the actual code that is powering this sample. And I'm gonna just tweak that camera a little bit, get that centered for you a little bit. Perfect. So I'm gonna switch over to Visual Studio. So again, I've cloned the project from the GitHub repo, and I have it open here. So to start developing Meadow applications, the first thing you'll need to do is install the Visual Studio extension. This works for both. There's one for Visual Studio 2019 and Visual Studio for Mac. And I believe there's some talks for VS Code support in the future, but today we're using full-blown Visual Studio. And of course, that's under extensions, and that's you can get the link from the website. So with that installed, you can make new applications, or we can run the application we have here. So I've opened up program.cs, and this is going to be our entry point to our application. Now, for those of you who have written some .NET code, I'm guessing there's quite a few of you here, this should look pretty familiar. Oops. This is our old friend, static void main, and probably looks a lot like a .NET Foundation console application. And actually, it's using, of course, .NET under the hood. This is a .NET application. Static void main, and we can see we go in, and in this case here, we're instantiating a Meadow app object. And so let's see what that looks like. You go to Meadow application. And here, if we go down to the constructor, we can see that we're doing a number of things, but right in the constructor in this application, we're doing some initialization. And then you can see there's some wiring up for the network. Grab some data. We're going to walk through all of this. Before I do this, though, I want to show you the Meadow Foundation drivers. We talked about that display driver. We talked about our temperature sensor. So these are distributed as NuGet packages. So I'm going to open up my dependencies here and open up packages. I'm going to show you here. So Meadow Foundation has a collection of drivers and purple drivers. And then we also have some packages that are for specific hardware. So in this case here, we have a TFT SPI package, and that has driver support for a number of displays. As well as we have one for our atmospheric sensor. I'll just drag that over to a tiny bit. There's one here for BMP 180. And I'll just show you if I go into manage NuGet packages. Let's do a quick browse. If we look for Meadow, you'll see a number of drivers in here. Let's do Meadow. Let's do like as one example. Let's do, I don't know, how about the SSD 1306? This is an OLED display. You can see here we've got a number of driver packages. And these are all, of course, linked from the website. So pretty fantastic. Regular old .NET patterns, all the things we're used to. So let's see what's happening with our app here. So we go back to our Meadow app class. Remember, this kicked off from our static void main. So the first thing we do is we call initialize. Now this is a convention. Of course, we can write any C# code here we like. And if we go to the initialize method, we're doing several things here. So the first one's really powerful. So we're actually controlling the onboard LED. Now, if you can see on the camera, there's a little green light glowing. And so the Meadow board has a full color and RGB LED built into it. And I love this as an example. So notice what we're doing here. We're instantiating an RGB LED object. Now, this is just C# code, and we're just instantiating a class, instantiating an object, but we're doing something really powerful here where we're telling this object how to talk to the hardware. In this case, we're specifying pins, and so that's really how we specify the connection points on our board. Now, in this case, it's on boards. We have special pins for that onboard RGB LED, and we specify, and it's interesting, although it's a single unit on the board, it's actually composed of 3 LEDs, red, green, and blue, of course, and so we specify all 3 pins. So now this is really powerful. This instantiates the object. This is our connection to the hardware. And now we're able to control the hardware with regular old C#. You can see here, we've got set color. Again, this is just normal patterns you'd see in a .NET application. We can do things like check if it's on. We can control the ports themselves, actually as the representation of that pin connection. We can tell it to blink. We can stop animations. C#. And the next one's really interesting. So this is a slightly different device. So this is our temperature sensor, the BMP 180. Now this is using a slightly different connection. This is called an I2C bus. This is a standard hardware bus. And these are protocols can be a little bit complicated. There's several things in here. We have to specify an address. You can control speed. But notice this API. In this case here, I'm going to create an I2C bus object. I'm going to hover this, and this is of type I2C bus. And then I instantiate an object, again, to represent my sensor. And now, much like we did for the LED, where we pass in the pins, well, in this case, we're going to pass in the connection to that I2C bus. Now, what's great about Meadow is there's a standard set of wires. If you look on our camera here, these two green wires are connected to 2 pins that will allow us to communicate over the I2C bus. And so now, again, creator object, connection to hardware, and now I can control the sensor. And you'll see something similar to the display. Now, the display is something that I think is really, really cool. This is a really nice API. So you'll notice here, it's a little bit different, that we're using a display controller. And there's a good reason for that. I'm going to move into this class and show you a couple of things. So in the display controller, this has just been a really encapsulation of our display code. And again, similar pattern, I'm going to initialize the constructor. Now, in this case, we're going to do something different where we're going to communicate with our peripheral using an SPI bus, serial peripheral interface. And this is another standard protocol for hardware. And again, we're covering a lot of ground. If you've never done hardware, these are all advanced topics. There's a lot of things to learn. But notice how simplified the code is. So in this case here, we're going to create an SPI configuration. Now, this display has a specific requirement for a mode. Don't worry about the details too much. It's all in the documentation and the sample. Copy paste, build a configuration, and then same pattern. You know what I'm going to say. I'm going to instantiate an object that represents our display. In this case, it's the ST7789. And we just add a few interesting things like our resolution. Some of these displays come in different form factors, and we can control the width and the height. This one happens to be 240 by 240. Really cool, really high resolution little display in a 1.3 inch diagonal size. But now this is a really cool thing. So I'm going to try and show this on the camera. I showed this to you very briefly earlier. So we've got a lot of hardware we can choose. So lots of displays. And this is maybe a little bit awkward, but they come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. My favorite's a round display here. Some of them are color. Some of them are single color OLED. Some of them are grayscale. And so historically, we'd have to write custom code to control each one. Well, in Meadow Foundation, we have this really nice abstraction. Much like when we're doing mobile applications, we don't have to write custom code for every different size of phone or every new phone screen technology. Well, it's the same thing for Meadow. And that's due to this guy here. This is the graphics library. And notice the pattern here. We instantiate a graphics library object, and we pass in the display. And this works because all the displays derive from a common display base class. And now this graphics library knows how to talk to this display, regardless of size, regardless of how it's communicating, I2C, over general purpose IO, SPI, etc. The graphics library doesn't care because there's a standard API interfaces on our base class. And it can now do things like draw text, draw JPEGs, draw primitives, lines, rectangles, triangles, circles, etc. And so in this case here, we're passing in our display. And then if I come down here, I'm going to just show you quickly in the update display class, or the render method, I should say. Again, this is taken from other common APIs. In this case here, we can clear. This is actually going to clear the buffer that represents our display. Set a stroke for drawing. We draw a rectangle, draw a circle. All great things that you've probably seen in other graphics APIs. And again, very intuitive. Let's have a look. Go here and go graphics. And then we can go right line, set the rotation, draw text, draw pixels, et cetera, et cetera. And the fantastic thing here, if we learn how to use one display, well, we understand the API for all the displays. So I'm going to go back to our Meadow app class. So many good things to show you. I want to show you a couple other interesting things. So here we instantiate our hardware, and then we make our connection for Wi-Fi. You can see we're initializing our Wi-Fi adapter. In this case, we're waiting because we really want that network connection before we stop. This is an asynchronous API. So we could await this, or we could do a fire and forget and go on to another initializations. And then in this case here, we're using our RGB LED for status. All right, a couple other fun things. So many good things to show you. So I want to show you network connectivity really quickly here. And so to do that, I'm going to go back to our project, and I'm going to open up our climate service class. And there's some really fun things here. So in this class, we're doing two things. We're talking to a really simple ASP.NET Core web service. Again, standard.NET. And actually, in this case, I've got my demo running on my Mac. I love that, .NET everywhere. Demoing the code on a PC, running .NET on hardware, running my web service on a Mac. Pretty fantastic. And then notice, so to communicate with our ASP.NET Core web service, what are we going to use? HTTP client. Of course we are. It's .NET application. What else would we use? Now, what do we usually get back from our web service? We get data. It's often encoded as JSON. So what are we going to use? Oh, why don't we use system text JSON? Yeah, we can pull in that standard .NET package in our IoT application. If I sound excited, it's because I am. I think this is really cool. And actually, it's a relatively new feature of the Meadow platform. Really excited to see it here. This is fantastic. We're consuming standard community NuGet packages and deploying them to a microcontroller and running that .NET code. Same things you would do in a mobile application, a desktop application, a web application. You're now doing it in hardware. Most of this you can go through. I think if you've done web communication before, this will look pretty familiar. And then I can show you just a couple of other really fun things here in the code. So let me just zip back up here. So back into our flow here, our constructor initializes the hardware, sets up our network connection, and then we're calling a sync data method. What I want to show you here are a couple of fun things, and just the nature of the APIs themselves that we're consuming from Meadow Foundation. So in this case here, we're calling a method called read temperature. If I go down to this, remember I showed you earlier, we create objects to represent our hardware. In this case here, we're going to use that instantiation, our object for our temperature sensor, and we're going to read the conditions. This is going to give us our atmosphere conditions. I'm going to show you this will give us our temperature. Again, we can read live values right out of that, consume it in our code. And then we're just going to use all the wonderful things I just walked you through. We read our data, we pass it into our display controller. That allows us to update our display. Then we go to our web service, we can grab the latest temperature reading. And then again, update our display with that temperature reading. And then here's an example of just posting. What I want you to see as well, of course, is all the await calls. We're using modern async APIs. So making non-blocking pretty fantastic. I think our time went by pretty quickly, so I'm going to show you a couple other fun things. I know this is a whirlwind, but don't worry, I have lots of good news because there's lots of other places for you to learn all about building hardware with IoT. If we go back to the Wilderness Labs website, we go back to developer.wildernesslabs.co. If you scroll down, the team did a recent online virtual conference called DevCamp. There's a ton of really cool things in here. You can learn all about stuff we talked about here today, but also about designing and 3D printing enclosures, designing custom PCBs for custom hardware. So taking your prototypes to something that you can actually produce at scale. Learn all about networking, wireless communication, lots of really cool stuff in here. But if that sounds like a lot and you want to ease into it, there's actually some really cool projects over at hackster.io as well. If you come here, that team has done a really, really great job. Also, it's really pretty. So go check this out. You can see here, so there's an example of what we talked about today, sending data from Meadow to an ASP.NET server via Wi-Fi, controlling motors, servos. I love this one. It's a radar. So we're actually using a distance sensor to read things around us. Lots of bits of user interface, so various ways of adding buttons and touch sensors, various displays, tons and tons of stuff. If you're looking for something to fill your weekends and the winter evenings, you can have a ton of fun here. Last but not least, if you're looking for a head start with hardware, so I showed you, hey, we can go to the website and peruse. They also have Wilderness Labs done a nice job of building what they're calling hack kits. And I'm just going to zip over here to the shop. And they've put together these really nice kits that have a lot of standard hardware. So if you're a little bit overwhelmed with the idea of trying to browse hardware, you can get them at all the usual places, all our favorite online stores. But they've also put together this really nice kit that gives you the Meadow, gives you a lot of standard hardware, and allows you to build a lot of those things you saw over at Hackster.io. So it's a great place to start. Done a nice job. And of course, the folks over there, they are my friends. They're my ex-colleagues, so I will say nice things about them, of course, but they are wonderful folks. They've done a great job of adding support. Really great community being built around here as well. And so with that, I'm going to wrap things up. So again, www.wildernesslabs.co. I just want to say a big thank you. You can find me over on LinkedIn. Of course, I'm on Twitter. You'll see lots of open source code for me as well on GitHub. And sometimes when I'm tinkering on my hardware, I post some things on Instagram. The Wilderness Labs team does a lot of stuff there too. So it's a great place to go find some really interesting hardware examples. Really just keep an eye on the general progress of that team. Watch them as they're building new drivers, building new projects. Lots of good fun stuff. Do we have any questions?
Yes, actually, Adrian, I was going to thank you so much for presenting. We actually do have one question. I was going to bring it up here, and I'm sure you get this question a lot. Question is from, I'm guessing, Saab. He or she asks, what are the advantages of Meadow over Raspberry Pi, which can also run .NET code?
That is a really great question, and I love Raspberry Pi. It's a really fantastic platform, and but the Raspberry Pi is really it's a tiny computer. It's a compute platform, but it's running full OS. It's running Linux,
right?
And it's an educational platform. I use it for all kinds of other fun stuff, but it's not designed to be super low power. I can't remember the stats offhand, but Meadows consume probably about 1/100th of the power.
Oh wow!
Population. And part of that is because it's not running the OS. It's not multitasking. Right. It's a single-purpose device, and so it's going to be lower power. It's a lot easier to harden for remote deploys.
Sure.
And it's just going to be way more stable. So you're not worrying about applications in the background or managing users. It's a rock solid stable, and it also is going to allow you to grab. It really gives you a path to commercialization as well.
Sure. So, I was going to say no, and it's interesting because like the way and I've done plenty of Raspberry Pi work myself, just like just messing around and whatnot, and you still have to secure the OS, right? You still have to handle all those things that you don't have to worry about with an embedded device. So that's pretty cool.
Absolutely, and the folks at Wilderness Labs are doing a ton of work around security and allowing things like remote updates and deployments at scale, so be a cloud service. So it's going to give you a far stronger, scalable commercial platform. I love Raspberry Pi. Different purpose, really different purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's when people, the big thing for people is saying, "Oh, it looks the same thing, so it must be equally the same." So
yeah, exactly, and that's the cool thing about the space is there's lots of platforms to choose from and lots of ways to innovate. And I saw a question of if it's more like Arduino, and that's an interesting comparison. So Meadow, it's Arduino-like in that it's a microcontroller and that it's super stable, but of course you've got .NET here, so you've got a standard language, you've got access to the library that the .NET community provides, and generally speaking, the Meadow board is more powerful than the traditional Arduino platform. Just in terms of compute power. But again, I mean, really, if you're a .NET developer and you want to leverage the community .NET libraries and leverage your existing skills, Meadow's way to go. Arduino, another fantastic platform.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Adrian, for taking the time to present. Always love your Meadow sessions, so thank you for that.